Grain Elevator and Processing Society is hosting their annual Jeeps Exchange Conference at the Kansas City Convention Center, February 22nd through the 25th of 2025. Jeeps Exchange is the biggest and best show in the grain industry with more than 400 exhibitors and 45 hours of education. It is the best place to find grain handling and processing operation solutions all in one place. Jeeps Exchange brings together industry professionals from across the world to help build professional networks and connect with the products you need. Come walk the trade show floor, take part in live demonstrations, innovation stations, and see new equipment. Make valuable connections through a variety of fun and exciting social events. Early bird pricing ends January 28th. Learn more and register at jeeps.com/exchange. Grain Elevator and Processing Society is hosting our annual Jeeps Exchange Conference at the Kansas City Convention Center, February 25th through the 28th. Jeeps Exchange is the biggest and best show in the grain industry with more than 350 exhibitors and 45 hours of education. It is the best place to find grain handling and processing operation solutions all in one place. Jeeps Exchange brings together industry professionals from across the world to help build professional networks and connect with the products you need. Come walk the trade show floor and partake in live demonstrations and trainings. Learn more at jeeps.com/exchange. Coming up is a conversation I had with two of the most sought-after food security experts in the world. This episode will focus on the aspect of cybersecurity and risks. Why should grain industry professionals begin to strategize and develop tactics to combat these threats? Are organizations doing enough? And just as important, what should the grain industry be doing collaboratively to protect and defend against cyber threats? All that and more. Let's go. Hey folks, welcome to Whole Grain. My name is Jim Lenz, your host and Director of Training and Education at Jeeps, where the mission of the Grain Elevator and Processing Society is about people and information and knowledge, and the mission of the industry is about fueling and feeding the world. Thanks for listening today and for joining the network of thousands of other grain handling and processing professionals across the globe taking strategic steps to grow professionally. The Whole Grain Show will give you the competitive advantage to win at work so you can make more of an impact. Global food security is one of the most fundamental and critical matters, and Jeeps members and grain professionals are on the front line. There are several broad topics that fall under the umbrella of food security, and each is of utmost importance. This episode will focus on cybersecurity and risks. In today's show, I facilitate a grain industry-specific discussion with Dr. Molly Jahn and Colonel John Hoffman. Each guest has a wealth of experience supporting, guiding, and making recommendations to our national and global food security. They'll not only share a historical perspective of cyber attacks and a level of awareness to global food security, but they will also communicate a clear message on the challenges the grain industry faces because of the lack of structure or mediating bodies to best support the industry against cyber threats. What are the conflicts we face as an industry that are keeping us from moving forward? They provide their recommendations to real solutions to this growing problem you face daily. All right, today we welcome Dr. Molly Jahn, professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she holds appointments in the Department of Agronomy, the Nelson Institute, the Global Healthcare Institute, and in the Wisconsin School of Law. She's principal investigator of the Jahn Research Group and is currently on an interagency personnel agreement from UW-Madison to work as a program manager at DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. We also have Colonel John Hoffman. He'll be joining us. He is a senior research fellow for the Food Protection and Defense Institute, a U.S. Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence at the University of Minnesota. It's great to connect with you, Molly and John. Thanks for being on the show. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Good to be here.
So are we.
To allow our listeners to get to know you a bit, to add some perspective and positive spirit, could you share with the listeners a professional mantra or success quote that you live by?
Colonel's first.
My mantra, suspect everything, protect everything.
Great. Thank you.
And I don't have a mantra. I have a person. And the person, Her name is Elizabeth Hayrick, and no one's ever heard of her. But she turned out to be a lady who showed up in the abolitionist movement in England back before anybody in America really thought about this. And she fought really hard for the abolition of slavery when she was a female. There was like no way her actions could have impact. And yet she ended up organizing the sugar boycott, which resulted in the first anti-slavery law in the UK in 1838, but she died not knowing she had any effect. And so I think a lot about her. She had no idea of the impact she ended up having. There were a cascade of events that, really changed history, but she didn't know she did it. And she just, did the right thing down in the trenches. And that's what Jahn and I try to do.
Great. Thanks for sharing. That's incredible. Wow. So it is so special to have you both in the show because of your tremendous background and your care and support surrounding global food security. And that's kind of my first question I wanted to ask both of you. We are seeing great emphasis placed on global food security measures in general. Why is this so?
Well, when things get tough, it turns to the most vital lines of supply, and food is really at the top of that list. We in America have lost sight of the possibility that food supplies could be interrupted. People like Jahn and I never lost sight of that and have been working throughout our whole careers to ensure that Americans and the rest of the world has a safe and secure food supply. But we have let a lot of our guard down. In World War II, we knew that American food could provide what the Allies needed to win the war, and we did. But since World War II, we've taken a lot of things for granted. And current events, the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, neither one of which is in global events a huge surprise, has shown us that our supply chains can be very vulnerable. And this has been an area of study for Jahn since his very early days in his military career from the 1970s, which I've always found very interesting. Jahn has been striving to call attention to these issues for his entire military active duty career, and now for a very distinguished career after his military service.
You're absolutely right. I mean, if you think about it, food is the one infrastructure you can't opt out of, right? Everybody's got to eat. You don't have to fly. You don't have to bank. You don't have to drive a car. You have to eat. And it's the first metric of the health of an economy. What's the price of bread? And when we look around with what's happening today and inflation that's occurring in food, there are reasons that is happening. Things are not working the way they should. And it's an indicator and a warning, if you will, that we need to be taking steps to protect these systems and protect this infrastructure. And we have taken it for granted. As Molly said, it's been just assumed by everybody we have plenty of food. Well, events like what happened with COVID-19 demonstrate that that's not always the case, but there's even more to it. The infrastructure has become so refined in some aspects that we don't have the ability to move food. Even if we have a surplus in an area, we can't get it to the grocery store. Because one of our problems is that the food that goes to food service is different than food retail. And so when you have a disruption to the system, we can't flex back and forth. We can't ensure that there's adequate nutrition coming into the channels that most people can access. And this is an example of why food security is a huge issue for our country and one that needs a much higher priority than it's getting.
Well said and clear statements surrounding that. I mean, this is an enormous issue and there's so many topics you could talk days for this. What I'd like to focus on here today, though, is examination on food security under the smaller umbrella, but very large umbrella of cyber security, cyber threats. So with a focus on cyber security now, when did we start to see cyber threats appear, in general? And then also, when did we start to see that in the egg industry?
Well, interesting. Cyber attacks began in the 80s. Most people don't realize this, but the first attempts to breach systems in the United States, both corporate and government, and well, even academic, is in the 80s. And there's been quite a bit written about that. And interestingly, that was really kind of an all infrastructure effort. The people that were doing that were trying primarily in those days to steal information or disrupt information or disrupt data, if you will. There was not the attacks that you see today after money. But but disruptions actually started back then. And that's one of the risks to the current, ag infrastructure. So when did we start seeing attacks on ag? Well, the first attacks that I'm aware of on ag actually occurred in the 90s. We had several attempts to steal IP, intellectual property, and these came from primarily foreign actors. Now, we did have some cases of teenagers in their basement on a computer, getting into systems and causing a little bit of mayhem. But the really deliberate attacks, the organized attacks that had specific objectives were theft of intellectual property. And in the food world, that's everything from recipes, supply chain information, trade, sales, management information, that sort of thing. Now that's evolved. And by the time 2005 rolls around, we're seeing very sophisticated attacks, stealing all kinds of information and even anti-competitive acts in order to try to disrupt components of a supply chain and the financial relationship between the bidders and sellers, if you will, buyers and sellers within supply chains to try to take advantage of disruptions. And then you began to see actual theft. That began both against the companies as well as targeting employees, because if you could get into the company's systems, you could get information about the employees, and then you can begin to target employees with identity theft and those kinds of things, as well as compromise employees to try to get them to help you do more heinous, more serious acts against companies or other people.
What many people who are involved in, for example, your membership, day-to-day business of moving American commodities from where they are to where they need to go, the temptation is to think, nobody's going to bother me. But in fact, these are linchpins in a very complex system. And so it is false to think that there is some protection in being in the middle of the country or being just a regular guy running just a regular American business. And so as an industry, one of the practices that John and I would strongly recommend is that there's some organization to prepare for what you might call a bad day, an attack in your sector that really causes havoc. What would you do? Can you flip to manual? Can you flip to paper? Or is the whole system down to a dead stop?
We'll be back after a quick break.
Jeep's training and education program is proud to release Introduction to Grain Operations. This new course is a multimedia version of what was known as Jeep's 500, with dynamic graphics, video examples, photographs, multidimensional illustrations, animations, and interactive exercises. This course is sure to prepare your team for the work you need them to do. This is a great industry primer at a great price. For a limited time, Jeep's members may purchase the course for just $195. Non-members still save and pay just $295. For more information, visit Jeeps.com. Wow, a lot to think about. Look at a direction where we can head, because this is such so organizations are essentially, oftentimes, there's this false hope. I mean, you said, we're in the middle of the country, who's going to do anything to us? So that logic needs to be, number one, changed. And number two, there has to be action, right? What's interesting is earlier in a conversation outside of this podcast, one of the things you had that was under that sort of thought is, do the organizations know the FBI number if there's a cyber threat? What are some other things that sort of fall under that thought for preparedness, for action?
Well, let me back up a second, and I'm going to key on something Molly said. Nobody in the ag world today exists outside of some supply chain. I mean, even the farmer who goes to the farmer's market, there's a supply chain right there. But most ag production and the rest of food processing, all the way to retail and food service, exists in some kind of supply chain. And it doesn't matter how small you are, how big you are, you can be targeted, because once somebody gets in the supply chain, somewhere along the line, they can begin to move through the digital connections of the supply chain and wreak havoc at different levels, go after ransomware or steal IP or whatever it is. So that suggests, I think, to people that whatever you do, you have to be thinking about where you fit in the supply chain. How do you relate to the people you buy from and the people that you sell to? How secure are your communications? How well do you have a plan in place with your providers and your customers on how you're going to deal with a disruption? As Molly said, how do you continue your operations? How do you keep going? How do you train your staff in cyber hygiene so they know what not to do, what to report when they see something, what kind of steps should be immediately taken. So these are training issues. These are coordination and digital and technology issues between you and the companies that you work with and across your own company and its internal operations. And it's also how you physically secure things in your system. There's a lot to look at when you begin to say, how do I harden my systems? And one of our problems, as we discussed earlier, are the legacy systems. A lot of what we have in the food and ag world, you think about it, they were developed in the 90s and we're still using them, but they're running on obsolete operating systems. And because of that, it's very difficult to secure them in today's environment. And sometimes it's not something you can easily change, whether it's because of rules on getting approval for some code that's used to run a device, or just the practicality of making a broad change in all of your operating systems. So therefore, you have to come up with physical solutions to how you isolate those systems so they can't be compromised from outside.
That involves a lot of work. So one of the things you talked about was training and education, source of the attack. That's a big thing. I know I worked in the past with Jim Stickley from Stickley on Security, big into education, big proponent, and others are working to support organizations. It's nothing that can be taken lightly.
It's actually, in a way, it's an exciting opportunity because every single employee is part of the company's protection against attack. Every single employee might be the first one to note something a little bit weird, right? So in a way, it forces companies to realize that every single employee is important, needs to be trained. And if you've got that kind of vigilance, right? If you've got every single employee paying attention and understanding not only what they're looking for, but what to do. Usually it's a simple action like notify somebody or unplug the machine, right? These actions can save whole networks, right? If they're done in a timely way. So I think it does really encourage companies to turn to their own workforce. And as John said, make cyber hygiene as mandatory as the most basic, as your boots, right? As your safety glasses. It's just a part of doing business in the 2020s. And every single person is on the front line. A phishing attempt, favorite way into people's computers, anyone can get that. And they do target employees of food companies. There is evidence that they do target employees of food companies. They find employees of food companies on Facebook or LinkedIn and work their way into those systems. Why, you might add? There are many reasons why. Some people go into systems and lurk. They're just there for a long time, presumably industrial espionage, waiting for a moment when there might be an opportunity for market manipulation, right? There are any number of reasons, both obvious like ransomware and more covert, that companies really need to recognize they have a physical presence and a virtual presence, and they're both really important. But we don't have an OSHA yet. Not that everybody loves OSHA, but we don't have an OSHA yet for cyber. We have kind of hodgepodge gathering of federal agencies with mixed jurisdictions and mixed motives, really, as John has said. And I think it's important. There's one in particular that I think it's important for your members to understand about this tension between the FDA's rule that requires, and I'll let John go from here. John, over to you.
Part of our problem is that this is a very fractured environment for our industry, if you will, the food and ag sector, because you have so many regulatory players involved at the state and federal level, and they have different jurisdictions and they have different motivations for what they're doing. And I'm not saying these aren't honorable efforts by all these organizations, but the reality is that, take FDA, for example. They do not deal in cybersecurity. Cybersecurity for them is not an issue because they view it as not food safety. And now this completely disregards the fact that digital systems are vital to managing, supervising, and monitoring our food safety systems. But yet they don't address cybersecurity as a requirement. The only thing that they do is require that if you have code in a device in your operational technology arena, like a temperature sensor or a metering gate or something that monitors the system, that code has to be repeatable and it's got to be approved by FDA. Well, if you built that in the 90s on a Windows 98 system and it still works, and you want to change it to, let's say, Windows 10 operating system, you've got to redo the code. That means you got to go back to FDA and get it approved. Imagine if all the companies with legacy systems suddenly went back to FDA to get all the code approved for all these devices, to suddenly upgrade them as CISA within DHS is asking everybody to do. Wouldn't happen. They aren't prepared to deal with it. And their rules, aren't really well suited, if you will, to facilitating the kinds of modernization that we really need. And they aren't adequately engaged, to put it quite frankly, in cybersecurity. And unfortunately, CISA doesn't have a great deal of depth in the food and ag area. So their advice is very, very general across all the sectors. And you have to understand that when you read it.
And their advice is often literally antagonistic to FDA's posture, which is basically don't change anything for decades in a row. So one of the linchpins that you can probably tell from what John just said is that there is a kind of bureaucratic, a reason that is very understandable from the bureaucracy's point of view at FDA, not to onboard cyber as an issue. But from a whole of government perspective, or whole of nation perspective, or from a national security perspective, which is where I am right now, that is a default in our mosaic of government that I think could have profound consequences. And so yelling at FDA to do something it doesn't know how to do and doesn't have the budget to do, yes, I get it. That's not the way forward. But understanding and assigning this responsibility clearly to an agency that has the capacity to interact with the sector, because one of the really important things we always remember is that this sector is entirely privately controlled. It's 100% in private hands. We don't have a utility like the electric grid, right? And so there's got to be support of the private sector by the public sector. And there's got to be that partnership. We've done it time and time again in America. We do it all the time. But this is a space where some leadership on both sides, I would argue, is desperately needed. And by the way, I'm speaking in my entirely personal capacity.
I would echo that. Public-private partnership is the way to go forward with this. I mean, that's how ISACs, the Information Sharing Analysis Center concept for the infrastructure, was developed. The private sector creates them. They cooperate with the government. They share information. That's the approach we need to take. We need to do that with education. And by the way, we need more expertise on the sector, the broad food and ag sector, within agencies of the government that do have primacy, if you will, for monitoring cybercrime and preventing it, whether that's Justice Department or Homeland Security or others.
I think for many years, people like John and I, not that we would have ever said this, but the feeling was a little bit, we ain't got no respect. Our sector was always, the low margin. What are you talking about? What are you worried about? For decades, John has said ever since an attack by the you have to say it. Yes, the terrorists and the Red Brigade in the 70s, right? They knew to attack a supply line. And John has been thinking about this ever since. But for, decades, pushing this message was just being a nuisance. And what happened around the time of the pandemic was, I know this happened to John. It certainly happened to me. We suddenly got a lot of calls. Like, where is that guy that was trying to tell us about this? Where is that woman? And the concern has drawn me back into government service. It's interesting to note that these deficits, these defaults of governance of the risk are now, in my opinion, so serious that they have become a matter of both national and global security. And so I have transitioned into a role where I can address some of those. We have very sophisticated adversaries we have a doctrine that says, okay, we're either at war or peace. Well, this is a peace that's not like like peace we used to know when everybody just left us alone and things were good and we could trade on an even playing field and our partners had shared values and we all played pretty nice by the rules. We're in a really different time. And the blurriness between war and peace, the difference in having an adversary that is coordinating through Chinese state-owned enterprises that are literally declared by the U.S. government now military assets, doing business as companies in the United States. I'm sure in your sector, it's certainly true in many. I shouldn't say I'm sure, but we are really watching a lot of those acquisitions. Some of them are very small and local. Some of them are covert by proxy. It's hard to escape the realization that there are new interests afoot in this space. And their motives may not be just to make a little money here and there, because control of a food supply is control of a nation. Over to you, John.
Well, I look upon it as a phrase I've used a couple of times. And if you think back to the Arab Spring, governments changed. They were overthrown because of the price of bread. That can happen in America. That can happen anywhere. And I'm not saying the government's going to be completely overthrown, but our infrastructures could be, and control of it could be overthrown. And we could have serious trouble going forward. It could be a great disruption to America and in particular to our food security.
And your sector or your members are among a number of really important parts of the ag industry that are literally on the front line. That's the way I view your membership right now. They are on the front line. They are a line of defense. And every single person working in your industry stands to make a difference in this space.
So where does that leave us then? What is the next step? What is the action that they can do?
Well, John has taken some really worthy actions that I think are important for your members to be aware of.
Sure. As Molly's pointed out, this is a primarily private sector owned infrastructure. And it's really incumbent on the private sector to step up and do what needs to be done. And I think this is an issue from the floor of an operating system all the way to the boardroom that people need to become involved. There are lots of things that need to be done. Companies need to rethink their entire posture on use of high technology and how they protect it. There are efforts right now to try to get the companies to collaborate in a public-private partnership to build an ISAC for cyber for the food sector. There isn't one. So how do you assess data and share it with people about what the threat is? Because the threat stream that we get through traditional channels is not tuned to this sector. So that needs to be fixed. We need to do a better job of cyber hygiene education. And this is for every employee all the way through the boardroom. And we need to do a better job training people on how to react in the face of a threat, perceived threat, or anything that looks unusual. And what do they do to harden their systems? We need broad exercises in companies on how you would deal with a disruption. If it happens, what would you do? How is your data backed up? Is it secure where it is? How quickly can you restore your systems if they're compromised? Do you have a plan to do that? A lot of companies don't realize that if you have a major attack and they penetrate your system and have been in there for a while, you're not just going to replace code. You're going to be replacing hardware. You're going to have to put a new system in. How are you going to do that? How are you going to work with your regulators to deal with that? And then, of course, as mentioned, how are you going to deal with Justice Department and its, cyber crimes division? Who's going to be investigating what happens? Because a crime has been committed and you're going to have a plan for how you collaborate and cooperate with them. And you want to do it quickly.
Backups, a lot of it is ordinary stuff. Don't click on that link, all that sort of thing. But I really want to just end underscoring how important what John said is about collaboration and exercises, because the attack may come through an individual member in your membership, but it will have ripple implications, as John said, all throughout, and the attack can move. So it's really important that we think of ourselves a little bit like the Dutch, right? The Dutch built dikes and everybody was responsible for maintaining those dikes. And the reason was because if you didn't, you were destroyed. So I think we have to take that polder mentality and cooperate, realize there are times we're coming together as a sector, which your organization promotes, is really critical. And I would argue this is one of those times. It is not business as usual right now. That is a top line takeaway. We are not in business as usual right now. And I don't know what that means in terms of where we're going, but I can say that with confidence. And I know John can as well.
Wow. Well, thank you both for joining us here today. Just a couple of things. If you do have any recommendations for resources, white papers, links, so our listeners can find out more information about improving the resilience of the nation's food supply systems and to reduce risks to the complex supply chains that support the agriculture infrastructure.
Well, we've got quite a bit on our website for the Food Protection Defense Institute. Go to the University of Minnesota, umn.edu, and then just do a search on FPDI, and that will take you to our website. You'll find quite a bit of information there. There's a lot that has been published out there. A web search would yield a lot of useful information. Just be wary of where it came from. You want to look for reputable sources for information. CISA actually, under DHS, publishes quite a bit. So if you go to the dhs.gov website and go to CISA, C-I-S-A, that will take you to a lot of resources, both in the training arena and general, practices, things that you should do to secure your systems. They're not well targeting the food and ag sector. They're kind of general, but they apply to most corporations. There's a lot of work yet to be done in that arena. And there are quite a few articles that have been coming out of late in industry publications. So when those come out, there's usually references in there, and it's useful to pay attention to some of those things. But the biggest thing you can do, work with your supply chain. Who do you buy from? Who do you sell to? Work with them. How are you going to harden your systems together? How are you going to ensure you have business continuity when there's a disruption?
And by the way, that is a FSMA requirement.
Yep.
So that one forward, one back is a great step. But being aware of the issue and being aware that these are not normal times and things may shift very quickly. We've seen in incident after incident, resilience often comes from the personal relationships in a field. So people who A, know what to do right on the spot, what to unplug, who to call, and B, know who to call, like in terms of continuity of operation.
Excellent.
And people like John and I have been championing this topic for a long time. I also have a group website, johnresearchgroup.net. It's an independent site I maintain while I'm on loan to my current position, but it's a good resource. There's a white paper there on cyber, and John and I will have another white paper out soon. Well, in fact, we plan to have 2 or 3 more papers out that'll be, we hope, good resources. But John's programs are built for industry and it should be a real step in the right direction. But your interest is also really important. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you very much for allowing us to come in and discuss this project with you, these issues, because, this effort to harden our systems is vital to our food security.
I will leave the things you mentioned in the show notes so people can have easy access to that. Appreciate your time and continue what you're doing. And we appreciate your support. This is obviously a global issue, and it's something that definitely cannot be ignored. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. And John, thanks so much for jumping on. This was awesome.
Happy to help.
We thank our guests, Dr. Molly Jahn and Colonel John Hoffman. There is no running away from this issue on global food security. You've learned why grain industry professionals and organizations should now begin to strategize and develop tactics to combat these threats. To continue the conversation and go deeper on what the greater grain industry should be doing collaboratively to protect and defend against cyber threats, I highly recommend you visit jeeves.com/webinars and register for the related webinar taking place next month. And then shortly after the webinar is concluded, it'll be available for playback to members in our Jeeps video library at jeeps.com. It's such an important topic, so please share this show with your grain industry colleagues and your Jeeps chapter members. This show has its own dedicated page on jeeps.com. You'll be able to listen to the show, see the transcript of the show, and you'll also be able to read the show notes. Be sure to visit jeeps.com/wholegrain to find out more about our guests and their important links and documents to support the topic. Have you listened to all the Whole Grain episodes yet? If not, be sure to do so, and don't forget to share with your network. You can do that right now. Let them know that the Whole Grain Show is also found wherever podcasts are located. You've received a number of 5-star ratings already on Apple Podcasts. By subscribing to Whole Grain on apps like Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, Listen Notes, and more, every show will be automatically downloaded to your device as soon as it is released. And Whole Grain Nation, if you could leave us a 5-star rating, that would mean a lot to us, as it will help others discover the show more easily. We can't wait to share with you all of our upcoming episodes. There's highly relevant topics and very engaging guests. I'm excited. If you and your organization want to sponsor an episode and be a featured guest on Whole Grain, or if you're interested in us producing audio ads to support your product or service, we can help you with that. Please reach out to me, Jim Lenz, Director of Global Training and Education at Jeeps, Grain Elevator and Processing Society. My email is james@jeeps.com, james@geaps.com. The Grain Elevator and Processing Society is the largest organization dedicated to advancing the grain handling and processing industry. Be sure to check out jeeps.com. Have yourself a great day, and thanks for listening to Whole Grain.